Okay, hello everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Yes, it's working.
That's for them.
Okay, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to be here in Lausanne. It's an honor and it's wonderful to be teaching in the flesh. I haven't done that in quite a while. So that's a treat. And it's wonderful to see some familiar faces there on the Zoom. We have source sheets here for whoever needs them.
We can't hear you.
Okay. You hear me now? This better? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's much better. Thank you.
Okay, sure, certainly. Okay. Is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay, so let's delve right in. Thanks.
Does anyone else?
Yeah. Let's delve right in. In less than 2 weeks, we're going to sit at our tables or other people's tables, and we're going to raise the matzah, and we're going to say, Ha lachma anya. Here is the bread of our privation that our forefathers, our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. And it'll sound as if we're about to start talking about the story of our forefathers and foremothers in Egypt, but instead we're going to move to talking about ourselves, because within 2 sentences, we're going to say, we are slaves now. Next year, we shall be free. Way later in Magid, we're going to explain that in every generation, a person has to see themselves, himself, herself, as if they themselves came out of the land of Egypt. But what does it mean? What does it mean we are slaves? In what way are we slaves? What do we see when we think about slavery? I asked my children recently, when I tell you slavery, subjugation, or oppression, what images come to mind? I'll ask you first, just one word, and in 1 word or 2 word sentences. What comes to mind?
Lack of control.
Lack of control. What else?
Choice.
Lack of choice. My kids gave more visual cues. Chains. Yes, my kids said shackles or the lash. Of course, it all depends very much on our personal experience. I have a good friend who's a Black American, whose forefathers were slaves in the South, and her mental image of slavery is very visceral and very literal. I opened the news today. I regretted it almost immediately because I saw horrific images from Bucha in Ukraine of mass murders. This is subjugation for me. For me, I see that. I see people who are murdered by an imperialist tyrant attacking them. And it's hard to get more oppressive than that. But today, as we revisit the story of the Exodus and preparation for Pesach, I want to talk about slightly different images or scenes of subjugation. Instead of talking about the horror, about the blood, about the lash, about the shackles, about the chain, I want to talk about the places where subjugation hits the soul, where we're enslaved on the inside and not just physically on the outside. And specifically, I want to visit 2 scenes, both from real life events, not from Tanakh, and through them revisit the story of the Exodus as it is told to us in the book of Exodus and later in the Midrash, and see what they illuminate, not only about the story of the Exodus as an adventure story or a deliverance story, but rather as God making war against the slavery that resided within our own hearts. Not just God taking us out of Egypt, but God taking Egypt and our internal slavery out of us, taking Yetziat Mitzrayim in the sense of bringing Egypt out of us and not us out of Egypt. And the first scene of subjugation I want to discuss, and I did not bring it in the source sheet, I don't want to give it a stage beyond just speaking about it, is Vladimir Putin's speech from February 24th on the eve of invasion into Ukraine. In that speech, President Putin explained how the invasion is necessary for the good of Russia. And he kept explaining how the West encroaches on Russia, subjugates Russia, challenges Russia. I'm sorry, can everybody hear me? subjugates Russia, how everything that happened in the past 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union was an encroachment on Russia, sabotage of Russia's success. And therefore, what he's about to do with his army and his missiles and his tanks is self-defense. I read through the speech. It was very difficult to read through because I kept getting stuck and saying, but this is not what happened. This is not factually true. This is not factually true. But if you try and put yourself in the shoes of someone who accepts the basic premise that the world is against us as in Russia, you can see how all of it together creates a coherent, cohesive point of view of the world. Worse, it's such a coherent point of view. Everybody's against us. We have to stand up for ourselves, that everything that follows can be justified within it. Because let's say your citizens, you, Putin, your citizens see pictures from Bucha in Ukraine of mass graves, and maybe they're horrified on a personal level, but if they bought into that speech and the worldview included in the speech of we have to do this for Russia, they'll say, look, it's collateral damage. Sometimes you got to do terrible things to defend your people. Everything can be justified within it. We heard the same speeches from Nazi Germany. We heard the same speeches about the white man's burden in the British Empire. It's a sentiment that we hear time and time again when the status quo, the powers that be, try and explain why everything they do is for the good of the state, for the good of their people. And this is the first scene of subjugation I want to talk. It's a scene that happens in history whenever a state, an empire, a power convinces its people that the system as it is necessary for their survival. This happened already in the ancient Near East and Far East, really. It happened already in the time of the Tanakh, when the great empires that evolved in the valley of the Nile and in Mesopotamia, in the rivers of around the rivers of Mesopotamia, enormous empires that were built on grain, on encouraging their citizens in ways we will discuss soon, to grow grain that can then be accumulated and turned into riches, taxed, turned into riches, and support the establishment of great dynasties, building of great cities, great pyramids, the writing of great epic stories. Those empires were built on the idea that you, Mr. Serf, Mr. Peasant, can't survive without us. If it wasn't for us, you would try and grow grain from the ground and bandits would come and take it. If it wasn't for us, your neighbor who has more sons with you will start a civil war against you and take away your food and you'll starve and your children will starve. And therefore, the fact that we come and take a lot of your grain, the fact that we sometimes conscript you to work for us, the fact that we sometimes kill you, we the rulers, it's worth it. Because otherwise your existence, as Thomas Hobbes put it, is brutish and short. And it's worth the investment. I would like you, please, I would invite you to open box 3 in the source sheet. I believe it's on page 2. I'm quoting here from a wonderful book by Yoram Chazoni called The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture. Thus, in the ethics of the ancient Near East, all action was ultimately directed towards the maintenance of the state, since all goodness was seen as flowing from it. Indeed, whatever served to maintain the close circle of farmer, tax collector, king, soldier, and priest was on its face for the good, since it kept the clockwork of the state in motion for another day and another generation, maintaining the mass of people alive and protected. The problem with that system is twofold, with that kind of faith that people have in their system is twofold. Can you see any problem with it? What kind of challenge does it present to ethics? Let's put it this way. If everything that supports the state is ethical and good by definition because it supports the state, it becomes extremely easy to justify any atrocity under the sun. It becomes extremely easy to say, let's throw the Hebrew babies into the river because they're a danger to us. And your people, who presumably are normal human beings with natural compassion for the young, will go along with it because they think that it's the good of the state, and the good of the state is their good. But it's worse than that. That whole system, that whole belief that the empire is necessary for the good of the people is based on a lie. I will show how God shows that it's based on a lie. But first, I'm still staying a little bit outside of our sources and just talking in general still in historiographical terms. It's based on a lie because, as a scholar called James Scott showed in a wonderful book called Against the Grain, the empires of grain that we described, be they Egypt, Babel, Assyria, that Moraya El mentioned earlier, Neo-Assyria, all these empires actually showed up in the world 500 years after the agricultural revolution, 500 years after people started growing grain, amongst other forms of collecting food. In other ways, people had a perfectly good strategy of survival where they relied somewhat on grain, somewhat on hunting, gathering, somewhat on foraging, somewhat on seasonal hunting of migration, somewhat on fishing, somewhat on wetlands animals. And they survived fairly well like that for hundreds of years. When the empires started rising, when the great civilizations started rising, one of the first things they did is outlawing all those other forms of sustenance other than crop, grain, growing grain, such as wheat, such as barley. Why? Because imagine that you are a king and you want to tax your people in order to accumulate wealth and build yourself up from a small regional king into an emperor of a chunk of the world around you. And let's say your people are hunter-gatherers. How exactly are you supposed to tax them? How exactly are you supposed to take animals that they hunt throughout the year from them? Let's say they eat legumes. Legumes are not seasonal crops. When exactly is a tax collector supposed to go through the villages and collect it? People just grow it and eat it, grow it and eat it throughout the year. So when we look at the legal codes of the ancient Near East, we see time and time again a very strong emphasis on outlawing all forms of food growing that are not either domesticated animals or the big grains that are seasonal and clear and accumulatable, because you can put them in a, how do you call it, granary, and collect them. Thank you, Israeli here, and collect them and preserve them for a while and create wealth for the empire. I would like to invite you to go to, and I'm sorry that the source sheet, we're going to be jumping back and forth. We're going back to page 1 at the bottom of the page from James Scott. What the state has often done once established is to maintain, amplify, and expand the agroecological setting that is the basis of its power, but by what we might call state landscaping. This has included repairing silted channels, digging new cedar canals, settling war captives on arable land, penalizing subjects who are not cultivating, clearing new fields, forbidding non-taxable subsistence activities such as swiddening and foraging, and trying to prevent the flight of its subject. In fact, one of the big concerns, according to Scott, of all those ancient empires was that people didn't really want to do that. People didn't really want to spend their lives tied to a piece of land, growing the grain that the king wants them to grow. And people tried to leave en masse sometimes. And there was extreme attention in all those ancient laws placed onto controlling the population, penalizing people who are not growing or trying to run away, and wars of conquest, where the focus was not on conquering land, but rather on taking captives, bringing them back and resettling them as part of your grain manpower. With that in mind, I want you to revisit with me a series of psukim from very early on in Chumash Shmot. I'm in box 3, page 2. Exodus 1, 8 to 10. I'll read it in Hebrew for those who want to have the English translation before you. ויקם מלך חדש על מצרים אשר לא ידע את יוסף, ויאמר אל עמו, הנה עם בני ישראל רב ועצום ממנו. These Israelites living amongst us, there are too many of them. They're too strong. הבה נתחכמה לו פן ירבה, והיה כי תקרנה מלחמה, if in the event of war, ונוסף גם הוא על שונאינו, ונלחם בנו, ועלה מן הארץ. If a war comes, they will rise from the ground, from the land. Traditionally, the commentators understand it as they will join our enemies and rise in the sense of fight against us. They will stage an uprising, if you want to talk about it in English terms. But with James Scott's hypothesis, and it's a very well supported hypothesis.
Actually quite controversial.
I'm sorry,
It's quite controversial.
meaning?
James Scott, there are quite a few people who disagree with his academic.
Correct, and we'll come back to that. But if you take James Scott's perspective and the idea that the grain was a form of subjugating people for the benefit of the ruling elites, and you read these Hebrew words, ve'ala min haaretz, another interpretation becomes apparent, namely that they will leave, right? Which goes very well with Paro's extreme concern later for losing the people and his extreme insistence on not letting them leave, even as his own wealth and his own people are collapsing all around him during the 10 plagues. We see Paro refusing to let them leave because the wealth of the empire, the success of the empire, the whole system, worldview of the empire depends on the people staying and working the land and doing what you need them to do.
Excuse me,
Yes.
wasn't it that when Yosef was in charge and selling what they had, people ran out of money and they had to give their lands and their labor as payment.
Correct.
So those riches that the Pharaoh had were due to Yosef.
Correct. I would not say that all of the riches are due to
No,
Yosef, but I think
this
it's a,
whole change. This was an economic change in the country within a short period. of time.
I'll reframe a little bit what you're
Okay.
saying. So thank you. It's correct. And I want to reframe it a little bit and put it in a broader perspective. In the same book, James Scott describes how different states at different times use different forms of forced labor, be it serfdom, be it corvée labor, conscription, where you take people either for the army or like Shlomo HaMelech did for building projects, and you force every tribe to give you a certain percentage of its men for certain times of the year to do the work. And all of the ancient empires used force to make people, their own people. I'm not talking about the Israelites as external tribe and your own people, the Egyptians, if you're Egypt, to work for you. But there are different types of subjugation, some more oppressive than others. It is a fascinating decision to include in Chumash Bereshit the story of how Yosef is making the machine, the state machinery of Egypt more oppressive and have more control. It opens a whole array of questions about measure for measure, about the consequences, about how what looks like a good decision at one moment might turn out to be not such a good decision a generation later, when the person whose power guaranteed the direction of history is no longer there to guarantee it, and the things acquire a life of their own and go forth. These are all fascinating questions. We will revisit Yosef a little bit in a bit about other aspects of the subjugation in Egypt. I just want to bring it together and say that what we're seeing here is that there's a whole system of imperial control that's based on controlling the means of production, the land, on controlling the people producing it, on controlling what it is that they produce. And how do you control them? You control them through laws, you control them through killing, you control them through your army, but you also control them, and it brings us back to what Chazoni said, through their own belief in the system's necessity for their survival. By the point that Paro is ordering his people to kill the Hebrew babies, they don't see that the system has an alternative. The system is all they know. This is the system they live in. This is the system that guarantees their life, their survival. their meager survival. We know from archaeological digs that people in Egypt, other than the kings, lived in horrific, unbelievable poverty. The life expectancy was extremely short. There were terrible plagues. People suffered immensely, but it was better than the alternative, because they didn't see an alternative. And this exact nexus of problems, the fact that people do not see an alternative to what they know, is what God declares war on in the beginning of Shmot, when he sends Moshe to exercise a makot. I'm in box number 1, page 1, box 1. ויאמר השם אל משה, ראה נתתיך אלוקים לפרעה, ואהרון אחיך יהיה נביאך, אתה תדבר את כל אשר אצווך, ואהרון אחיך ידבר אל פרעה, ושילח את בני ישראל מארצו, ואני אקשה את לב פרעה, והרביתי את אותותיי ואת מופתיי בארץ מצרים, ולא ישמע אליכם פרעה. From the beginning, be advised, the king is not going to listen to you. ונתתי את ידי במצרים, והוצאתי את צבאותיי, את עמי בני ישראל מארץ מצרים בשבטים גדולים. I will take out the Jews with great chastisements, plagues, miracles. And here we come to the main point for me. וידעו מצרים כי אני השם. The Egyptians will know that I am God, והמטותי את ידי על מצרים והוצאתי את בני ישראל מתוכם. If God wanted just to take the Jews out of Egypt, I assume that God could have done it like this. But that's not the point. The point is that the Egyptians themselves, whose eyes are closed by the entrenchment of the system they're part of, will see beyond it. Will see that there's something in the world beyond that closed circle of grain, peasant, tax collector, king, etc. that Chazoni is talking about. And God does it through the 10 plagues. God does it by targeting, but choosing carefully which targets he wants to break open, to open up this very cloistered view that the Egyptians have on the world. First and foremost, by targeting the wealth itself. What is the main source of the wealth of the land of Egypt? I'm sorry? The Nile, exactly. Why is there even an empire there? Because the Nile brings a steady supply of water that can be used to grow grain and fish and other sources of food, but we'll focus on the grain right now. So God starts by targeting the Nile. In many ways, the Nile is the source of civilization. If you look at box 2, Rabbi Soloveitchik, in his book Vision and Leadership, where he talks about Yosef and Moshe, talks about the dreams of Paro, the other Paro, the Paro that Yosef then helped to make the machinery of a state stronger and more oppressive. That Paro dreamt about the good cows coming out of the Nile and the bad cows coming out of the Nile. And Rabbi Soloveitchik explains the vision thus. From the river, the source of civilization, abundance, and prosperity, emerged beautiful creatures and also the ugly cows. The blessings of the human civilizing experience may be completed by the demonic forces which the genius sets free. Some philosophers have questioned whether the dream of civilization, is worthwhile. Perhaps it would be more beneficial to man to inactivate rather than accelerate the process. I want to pause here and say that indeed, James Scott, specifically in his thesis about how oppressive states are, seems to be in support of that particular position, that it's better for us without civilization. Rabbi Soloveitchik does not agree with that approach. He says, Paro was troubled in the morning. I'm sorry, I'll just say it in my own words. It's simpler here. He says, no, it's important to pursue higher forms of life. Civilization allows us to record our stories. Civilization allows us to create great things, to develop modern science and technologies that heal the world and expand our life expectancy, just to speak about one major difference between us and the ancient Egyptians, and even more so the hunter-gatherers that came before them. But we can't do that without acknowledging the cost of civilization building, the coercive elements of it, the dangerous elements of it, the exploitative elements of it. And Joseph thinks, according to Rav Soloveitchik, that he can control it, that he can help Paro expand his civilization while refining it. What we see in the story of Yosef is that it may succeed for a generation, but once you start a certain process, you don't control all of its outcomes and all of its consequences. And then comes Moshe, who's not like Yosef, who's not working within the system, who's not cooperating with Paro and working as his right-hand man, even though in the beginning of Moshe's story, it looks like he's positioned to do just that. He's brought into the court and raised within it. No, he's the one who leaves and comes from the outside and fights against it and starts breaking the system instead of propping it up. And he starts with the makot that target the Nile, the blood and the frogs, and continues with the makot that target the grain, that target the grain and the domesticated animals, namely the sources of food of Egypt, be it devel, be it arbe, the locusts, be it barad that breaks everything in the field. And in a systematic way, breaking apart the very wealth of food that for the simple Egyptian justifies the atrocities of the state. Because if the state no longer gives you the food and the water that are the reason you comply with it in the first place, then maybe it's not as perfect a status quo as you were led to believe. And we see that God does just that. God doesn't simply target the wealth of Egypt. God goes beyond that and starts targeting the faith of the people in their system, in their world that they exist in, by creating careful distinctions between the experience of the Egyptians and the experience of the Jews. Time and time again, and certain makot in particular, we see that God makes this point and declares it as his point from the get-go, that you will see how the animals of the Egyptians will die and the animals of the Jews will not. Or the Jews will have water to drink and the Egyptians will not have water to drink. In other words, God is forcing the Egyptians to notice that it's not simply natural disasters falling upon their heads, that there's an intention behind these disasters, that there's what we call in Hebrew, yad mechavenet, a guiding hand that makes sure exactly how these disasters hit them. Let us put ourselves for a second in the shoes or sandals or bare feet of an Egyptian peasant. They have no idea what's going on. Let's be honest about that. They're not in Paro's confidence. There's no free press to inform them about Moshe arrived in the palace, trouble to arrive, trouble to come soon. They have no idea. All they know is that they lived a difficult life and they go on living a difficult life, and suddenly their life becomes more difficult. But they can notice when the field that's worked by a Jew next to them and the field that they're working, and the field that they're dealing with are somehow miraculously faring very, very differently in a situation. We see the success of this campaign, of God's campaign to awaken questions and lack of faith and lack of conviction in the system in the Egyptians, gradually grow through the process of the makot. I would like you to please go to page 2, box 4. I'm looking at the second source in Exodus 9, when God announces makat barad, the hail. הנני ממטיר כעת מחר ברד כבד מאוד, אשר לא היה כמוהו במצרים, למין היום היווסדה ועד עתה. ועתה, שלח העז את מקנך ואת כל אשר לך בשדה, כל האדם והבהמה אשר ימצא בשדה ולא יאסף הביתה, וירד עליהם הברד ומתו. For the first time, God is giving the Egyptians an opportunity to avoid disaster. Until now, God made the distinction between the Jews and the non-Jews very clear. Now God is actually declaring his intentions, and he tells them, if you stay indoors, you and your animals will be safe. And we see that indeed, that created a distinction amongst the Egyptians themselves, because as we see in Pasuk Kaf, those who feared God from the slaves of Paro, הניס את עבדיו ואת מקנהו אל הבתים. ואשר לא שם ליבו, those who didn't pay any mind, אל דבר השם, ויעזוב את עבדיו ואת מקנהו בשדה, and it follows to tell us that they died. This is a very interesting form of sabotaging Paro's control over his people's psyche. Because by inviting the slaves of Paro, they're still the slaves of Paro here, the Egyptians, they're not free people. Even the rich and powerful are the slaves of Paro in the Egyptian system. By encouraging them to take precautions, in a sense, he's encouraging them to think, to realize that perhaps Paro's orders or Paro's strategy is not actually in their best interest. And he's inviting them to act upon this knowledge. It may sound small, it's not a big thing. Okay, so they put their slaves indoors and they, their slaves and their animals indoors and they gain by it. What's the big deal? But for the first time, they are invited to dissent from Paro, to say, Paro, maybe not. Maybe we don't want to do what you tell us. The road between that and starting a revolution is still a very long road, and it doesn't actually happen. At no point do we hear that the Egyptians are starting a revolution against Paro. But it's starting to dismantle that scene of subjugation that we started with, the scene of subjugation that happens in the mind of the subject, where they're convinced that the system is in their own best interest. And later, we see that they actually speak up. In the next source, in Shmot Yud Pasuk Zayin, ויאמרו עבדי פרעה אליו, עד מתי יהיה זה לנו למוקש? שלח את האנשים, ויעבדו את אדוני אלוהיכם, הטרם תדע כי עבדה מצרים. Don't you know that we're lost? This may not sound as exciting as storming the Bastille, but it's for the people of Paro who are totally dependent on him, to speak up to him in this way is shocking. And in this way, God is slowly preparing the ground for them to have a frame of reference to understand what's going on in the world around them, and to understand once the Israelites do leave and their system is left in wrecks, to understand that maybe they shouldn't accept whatever post-factum justifications Paro is going to give them for their losses. Perhaps what they should do is ask themselves, is that really the regime we want? I want to pause for a moment, and anybody else, before we continue, we're gonna revisit a different scene of subjugation, a different type of way of controlling your citizens. But first, anybody wants to ask questions, comment? Anybody in the Zoom? So that's yes. Okay, so let's get going. We see how the first 9 makot are targeting Egypt's wealth and the people's faith in the system being for their own benefit. But we don't see a revolution. And the reason we don't see a revolution is actually pretty easy to deduce, because the people are not simply following Paro because they think he's good for them. They're also afraid of what he's going to do to them if they don't. And fear, perhaps more than shackles, perhaps more than anything else, fear is that which subjugates the soul. I want to invite you into a family memory with me for a moment. My parents, as some of you may have surmised from my name, grew up in the Soviet Union. And one of my father's early childhood memories is a memory that he shares with millions and millions of Soviet kids of his era, kids who were born and grew up in Stalin's days. Namely, he remembers sitting in his home with his father and cutting out an entry out of the great Soviet encyclopedia. Every person, every household in Russia had the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. It was published in volumes, so you would get the new volume and put it on your shelf, and it was a declaration of faith and loyalty that's very important to make, to own it and have it. I'm not saying everybody, but it was very, very prevalent. And since the letter Be is the early one, it's the second letter in the Cyrillic alphabet, everybody had that volume early on. But then a general who had an entry in the letter Be fell out of favor with Stalin. Falling out of favor with Stalin means that you're dead, that your friends are dead, that your family are endangered, a lot of very unpleasant things. It also means that the tyrant wants to delete you from history. And suddenly that general's great achievement in World War II were no longer what's supposed to be official history. But there's an entry about him in every household in Russia. So the authors of the encyclopedia or editors, I don't know exactly how they did that, whatever, the Stalin's mouthpieces, sent out a new entry about something else in the same letter to put in place of an entry that everybody was ordered to cut out. And in every household, people sat with scissors and glue and cut out an entry and put in a new entry. And all those people knew that this is nonsense. You can't cut out and glue a new piece of history without knowing that what you're doing is whitewashing history to please your ruler. And yet they all sat and did it. And they did it because they were afraid, because not to do it means that if somebody, anybody, your neighbor has something against you and they find out you didn't do it, they will have cause to tell on you to the KGB. Or let's say the KGB wants you to tell them some information about your wife or your friends or your other neighbors whom you like, and they find out you don't have the right entry, they will use that to pressure you into becoming a tool of information, of enforcement over other people. So you are very carefully, and even though you're within your own fortress, so to speak, within your own four walls, you very carefully comply. You subjugate yourself, you make yourself serve the narrative and desires of the ruler because you think that your survival, correctly, you think that your survival depends on that. And I said before, we will revisit Yosef briefly, because the truth is that we see that agent of subjugation, fear, appear in the Egyptian story before the Paro that starts turning us into actual slaves. We see it already in the Joseph story. Please, I'm inviting you to look at page, sorry, I'm jumping way ahead to page 4. The source at the bottom. From Genesis 50, after Yaakov dies, having asked Joseph to bury him in the land of Israel. And we hear the following: V'ya'avru yemei bechito, the days of mourning Yaakov are past. And then Yosef wants to bury his father. Now, having seen the relationship between Yosef and Paro until now, having seen how integral Yosef was for building the Egyptian subjugation machine, we would perhaps expect that Yosef would go to Paro and say, hey, I need to go. I need a leave of absence. I have to bury my dad. And Paro would say, sure. But that's not what happens. Instead, we hear, וידבר יוסף אל בית פרעה לאמור, אם נא מצאתי חן בעיניכם, דברו נא באוזני פרעה לאמור, אבי השביעני לאמור, הנה אנוכי מת בקברי אשר קריתי לי בארץ כנען, שמה תקברני, ועתה אעלה נא ואקברה את אבי ואשובה. There's a lot to unpack in this short 2 verses that we read just now. First of all, he's not talking to Paro. He's talking to Beit Paro, the household of Paro. Secondly, he's not talking as a man used to command, a man whose job was to run the land of Egypt for Paro until now. And until now, we only saw him from the moment of his ascension being very authoritative and clear and decisive about what he does. No, we hear him saying, Im na matzati chen be'enechem. Later, it will echo in the Megillah when Esther, who has no power over on, has to gain the king's favor to achieve her ends. So here Yosef has to gain the favor, not even of the king's men, of the king's household, to achieve what he wants.
I'm sorry, did you just say Esther, who had no power of her own?
In the Persian court, yes. Are you objecting to that?
I would say Esther had quite a bit of power.
No, she didn't at that point.
I'll explain. I'm sorry. I'll elaborate on what I mean. Okay. I can see I'm using shorthand here, then I'm skipping a few steps. So thank you for calling my attention to that. I would explain that what I mean is that Esther is a queen after Vashti. And we already saw what happens when Vashti said no to the king. The king didn't kill her immediately or exile her, whatever, or demote her, whatever, however we understand what's happening there. The king has to call a council, but with the encouragement of a council, he can easily get rid of her. Esther rises into power in the same court. If the king decides to get rid of her, he can. Whatever power she has is the power that she gains by playing the political game and gaining the king's favor and getting the king to be on her side.
I was just saying in general, if Esther did not like one of her servants, she could dismiss the servant. To say Esther did not have a lot of power, if you compare Esther to an average person in Ahasuerus' kingdom, Esther had an awful lot of power.
That is,
That's not true. No, she didn't. You're in the fairy tale Esther story. Esther was among all of these women in the women's house. And she could only do something if the king called her, and she says that very clearly to Mordecai. I'm a nobody. I'm, you're asking me to die.
I think it's actually is relevant to what we're talking about, and I'll explain why. Because
the reason it's relevant,
Relative.
the reason I'm saying it's relevant is because Esther, we have all learned Megillah Esther in many different ways, thank God, from many different perspectives, is Esther had quite a bit of influence and power as the queen. She had very little power compared to the king. Joseph, who remember, who were these are both descendants of Rachel, had quite a bit of power. He had very little power compared to the king. That's what I'm saying. One of the things that we hear over and over is one of the similarities between Esther and Joseph, and this is a phrase used over and over, is they both rose to be second in command of a non-Jewish kingdom. I'm not suggesting Esther's power was as powerful as Joseph's, but I think it is an important similarity to note.
So two things. First of all, thank you. This is a very good, I'm glad you brought these differing opinions here because it actually helps me to sharpen, so to speak, the point I want to make here about Joseph. Just a moment, in a second. Namely, that when I talk about power, right? When we talk about power, we can look at it in localized terms. We can say, oh, Esther can fire whichever handmaiden she wants. She's powerful in that scene. Joseph gets to decide who gets bread, who gets life. This is enormous power. And that's true. Within that context, he has a lot of power. But power exists as part of a system. And when you look at the system, you see that Joseph and Esther, in very different ways, perhaps the better comparison in a sense is Joseph and Mordechai, have power as long as they are useful and pleasing to the actual source of power, which is the king. And here I would like to go up in the source sheet for a moment.
Haman is the example because he got rid of him within minutes.
Exactly. Haman and Vashti both are dispensable, which leaves us not exactly in a state of great confidence about Esther and Mordechai at the end of the just a moment. I just want to read this quote here. Yoram Chazoni, when he analyzes Yosef, and he talks exactly about this moment when Yosef doesn't feel comfortable asking the king to leave, and instead kind of plays a political game of manipulation to say, oh, please, my father made me swear. It's really important if you like me. And then the king says, okay, but leave the children here, which is what the later Paro is going to say, right? So Yosef and his brothers go, but they leave their children in Egypt. They're not free to just come and go as they please. So what Yoram Chazoni, writes about that, I'm in the middle of the source sheet here. I'm in the box 7, the second quote from Yoram Chazoni. Mighty though Yosef may be, he is not free. No longer a shepherd like his fathers, he is instead a servant to Paro in the house of bondage. There is no question, of course, but that this house of bondage remains one of the great political and economic power on earth, et cetera, et cetera. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. And there is likewise no question, but that a man such as Joseph necessarily feels himself free as he gives out order to others. But compelling as this experience may be, it is an illusion. The first among slaves may be powerful, but a slave he remains. subject to annihilation by his master at a moment's notice, at Paro's house, no less than in that of Potiphar. When once he is faced with this prospect of Paro's wrath and a possible loss of favor, Joseph is struck with the self-same terror of the Hebrew slaves facing that other Paro's generations later. You wanted to make a comment?
Yes,
Mhm.
I was very happy that you mentioned the fact that it's that Joseph had problems before.
Mhm.
Because I would like to compare how Paro welcomed Yaakov when he came, and in such a gracious way, you would expect that, of course, once he died, he'd be able to be buried where he wants to be buried. That to me is the big comparison, is that the beginning of Yaakov's time in Egypt and the end of Yaakov's time in Egypt as being total dichotomy. So that's more of the proof of the fact there's something very, very, it's not the beginning of the Jewish problem in Egypt.
Yeah. There's a certain, to reiterate or reframe what you're saying, thank you. There's a certain, again, I go back to the question I started with of how do we imagine enslavement, right? And like I said, when I asked my kids, they had very clear images. They thought there were chains chaining you like a gang chain to each other and a lash. And I was a little bit disturbed by the level of detail they came up with, but okay. But the truth is that subjugation is every now and then there's a war of conquest and people are actually subjugated. Sometimes people are kidnapped from their houses as slaves. It happens. But more normally in the course of human affair, it's an encroachment. It starts with hospitality. Lavan opens his door to Yaakov. Later, Paro opens its door to Yaakov. Then it starts with worsening conditions of employment. It continues with a feeling of fear of, I'm not going to be allowed to leave. And eventually, it evolves to the level of fear where you sit and cut the entry out of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia because to do otherwise might bring your death or the death of your loved ones. There's a spectrum that takes place, and it's beautiful how the Chumashim allow us to watch it happening. They don't just put us straight into the enslavement in Egypt, they let us see how from the beginning of Yosef times in Egypt, we already see us bleeding into this fear. And I'm jumping to the bottom of the quote from Chazoni, the physical works of mortar and brick is really nothing more than the concrete expression of an inner enslavement. And when God sets out to free us from Egypt, he's not just setting out to free us from, he's not just setting to free us from physical Egypt. He's not just setting out to help the Egyptians overcome their sense that the system serves their needs and is the best, and therefore should define what's good and bad in the world. But rather, he is also trying to force us to overcome that internal fear. And God does that in Makat Bechorot. I'd like to invite you to open page 3. We're going back to box 6, where God gives us the following instructions. דברו אל כל עדת ישראל לאמור, בעשור לחודש הזה, ויקחו להם איש שא לבית אבות, שא לבית. I'm pausing here to say that the classic commentators immediately jump to say that lambs were divine, they were treated as some sort of divinity. So the fact that you tied the lamb, clearly in preparation of killing it, it's sending a message to your enemy, to your neighbors. It's telling them, this God of yours, I'm going to kill it. And it's right here. And you're not doing it covertly. You're tying it right there. Everybody sees it. Everybody can hear it, making meme sounds, as my kids call them, for several days. And then, והיה לכם למשמרת עד 14 יום לחודש הזה, ושחטו אותו כל קהל עדת ישראל בין הערביים. ולקחו מן הדם, ונתנו על שתי המזוזות ועל המשקוף ועל הבתים אשר יאכלו אותו בהם. Not only do you keep the lamb there for everybody to hear and see and perhaps smell for several days, you then take its blood and put it like a declaration on your door. Every Egyptian in the area knows that you just killed what, according to our understanding, was of some divine value to them. In other words, you have to look at your overlords, the same people that you are so terrified of, that you would do everything they tell you because you're so afraid of the horrors they can inflict upon you and your children, and do inflict upon you and your children. And you throw in their face the fact that you're no longer afraid of them, or that you're enough not afraid of them that you dare to defy them. My father, Natan Shranasky, compared it, growing up, he compared it to the process of applying for a visa of immigration from the Soviet Union. Because to emigrate from the Soviet Union, it wasn't just, you go to the government and say, I want to leave, and usually get refused, as we know. No, you had to go and get the signatures of your boss. Your boss has to sign that he knows that you want to leave the workers' paradise, the best place on earth, and go to Israel, a Zionist, horrible, fascist entity, as it was described in Soviet Union. Now, the boss has to cover his own back. He has to make sure that nobody comes to him then and says, oh, you support a Zionist. So he has to fire you. And he has to convene a meeting of all the workers where they all tell you off for how terrible you are for wanting to leave. And then after you get this signature, you have to go and get your parents' signatures. And they have to notify their bosses that they signed on that. You have to go and notify the person who's responsible for where you live. Every building had like Vad Bait, except instead of taking care of rusty plumbings, also ideological purity on the sly. And he is very likely to convene a meeting of the neighbors where they're going to condemn you. And only after you collect all of these signatures do you go and send it to the central authorities, whereby, assuming you get refused, which is the reasonable assumption, you can no longer work at a normal job. Your neighbors are very likely to ignore you if they don't find a way to kick you out of the building altogether, because they don't want to be tainted in the eyes of the authorities by association with you. Schools and kindergartens are going to give your kids a lot of problems. And you have to live in this bizarre existence where you're no longer part of the system. It's like you're in internal exile because you can't leave, but you also can't live a normal life within the Soviet Union. But as my father said, going through that process is extremely liberating because you're burning all your bridges. You're putting it out there that you're no longer buy into the credo and the creed of the Soviet Union. You no longer believe that this is the best place on earth. You no longer accept that this is the system that serves your interest, as we discussed earlier in the talk today. Rather, you say, this is not for me, and I'm willing to pay the price. And with that, you excise that first encroaching fear that otherwise makes you a loyal Soviet citizen, not because you necessarily agree or accept or comply in your mind, but because you're too afraid to do otherwise. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to say that because I did a study of the memoirs of several Jewish activists, of course, including your father's memoir translated, but anyhow, and it was very interesting. One of the common features of these, or aside from the anti-Semitism as a child and so on, was the fact that their first expression of I felt like a free man was not when they came to Israel or whatever. I felt like a free man when I applied to get an exit visa.
Mm-hmm.
That they stated that specifically. That's when they took the slave out of themselves and felt free at that moment when they applied, knowing everything you just described would happen.
Thank you, Steffi. Yeah,
Or even worse. Yeah.
Yeah. No, exactly.
And this was just not, but a whole group.
Yeah, I know. It's the thank you for putting it in the broader context here. That it's not just my father's experience. It was really the communal experience of the refuseniks, and many people commented, people who met the refuseniks in Moscow, that they look like free people. They're surrounded by people who are not free, but they're free, even though they're obviously not.
And being tailed all the time.
All the time, tailed, arrested, harassed. They can be sent to forced conscription to the army or to the labor camp or to the gulag, to the prison in the gulag. But they're saying what they believe in. And this is the beginning, just like fear is the beginning of enslavement in Genesis with Yosef, so is lack of fear the beginning of freedom in Shmot. And it's very crucial that this is what happens on the eve of going out. That, okay, God did all the 9 first plagues by himself. God did it for them. But for them to step out of the Egyptian story and start their own story, they need to do something also. They need to push off some of what keeps them down. The question is that enough? And the answer that the Chumash tells us is no, it's not enough. Because when they actually go out, it's not exactly a celebratory event that we might expect. Please go to page 5, box 8. The beginning of Parashat Beshalach, a moment where we might rightly, yes?
But isn't there a difference? Because we're talking about Jews have been enslaved all these years, right?
Mhm.
In Egypt. And while I respect what the refuseniks did, and I understand where you're making the comparison, there is a difference between the literate understanding of the refuseniks, of their ability to understand and know what is going on, whereas the enslaved Jews here, I'm not sure they were quite as understanding or literate or comprehending what the heavens was going on there.
Thank you. Who's speaking? I can't see your name.
My name is Reba. Don't worry about it. Reba Haynes.
Yeah, Reba, thank you. And I think you're making an excellent point. Just like the Egyptian commoners didn't know what was really going on, and God had to really work hard for them to start seeing that there's something going on that's not just another set of natural disaster a la normal in the ancient world at that time. So do the Jews. It's not so clear, other than, Moshe, Aaron, and the Zkenim and the leaders of the people. It's not so clear what the regular Jews knew and what they understood about what's going on. I want to put it, I'm sorry, just a moment. I just want to put it in I want to make 2 short comments about that. One goes a little back and one takes us back to the next step of this process. Looking back, when Moshe tells them, kill the lamb, put the blood, he also gives an enormous gift. And I didn't bring it in the source sheet, but he gives them an enormous gift. He tells them, one day your children will ask you, this is how we're going to celebrate the memorial of this day. And this is what God told them to tell them. But then Moshe adds something that isn't what God told him to say, or not in the words that are quoted as God telling him to say it. He says, and one day when your children ask you why we're doing this holiday, you will tell them about this night, about what's going to happen tonight. So in a sense, he's giving them, first of all, the comfort of knowing that they're going to win, or a certain sense of, oh, when you look back at it, it's not going to be a disaster and then the Egyptians massacred us, but rather we are out. You will have children, you will have a next generation to pass the story to. And he's giving them the beginning of a narrative. Narrative is the way we organize our information about the world. He's giving them the beginning of a narrative that helps all of them at that moment who hear him, at any rate, understand what's happening and what the meaning of it. That said, Reba, I agree that when they go out of Egypt, they're not clear yet. It's not so clear, presumably, to everybody what's going on. And we see it because they're not celebrating. They're not singing a song about how we came out of Egypt at that point, the point of walking out of Egypt. Instead, what we hear, and here I am in the source sheet in Shmot Yud Gimel, Vayehi beshalach paro et ha'am, ve'lo nacham Elokim derech eretz plishtim. God didn't take them the straight way. Ki karov hu, ki amar Elokim pen inachem ha'am, pirota milchama ve'shavu mitzrayma. God is worried that they will run into difficulty, turn right back and go back. Not only are they perhaps not so clear about what's going on, they're not so clear about what they want. They're not so clear about what's worth it at this point. Many commentators point out that the word vayehi that starts Parashat B'Shalach in this verse is not such a happy word. It's a word that often in our scripture echoes the word nehi, lament. It's a word that indicates that there's something problematic. And the commentators ask, why? Why is that moment, the moment when they come out of Egypt, the moment we've been working towards for 13 chapters in the Exodus and 10 plagues, why is it prefaced with the word vayehi, a word of lament? And Rabbi Tzadok Milublin, one of the great Hasidic commentators, makes a very interesting comment. He says, the answer lies in the next word, B'Shalach Paro et ha'am. At this point, they're not self-starters. They're not going out because they want to go out. They go out because Paro sent them. They are still mired in their identity as the slaves of Paro. Yes, they killed the Egyptian gods. They killed the lambs. And they put the blood under great duress and in a moment of great tension and great fear. They did it. But they're not totally done with being Paro's slave. They're not yet people who think for themselves, act for themselves, initiate things for themselves. If you wish, we can take a step back and say even more than that. At this point, they are the pawns in a war between God and Paro. And of course, we don't put God and Paro on the same plane ever. But from their perspective, they either go out because Paro told them or because God told them. In other words, because some entity that's bigger and more powerful than themselves tells them, but they didn't choose it yet. They didn't make the choice that they want this type of freedom that God is offering them, the freedom of being covenanted with Him and fulfilling His mission in the world. And when people don't make a choice, they don't have staying power. And when they run into difficulties, they won't necessarily be able to withstand them because they don't have the spine of resolution. Yes,
Well,
that's
it's even more than that, I think. I
Mhm.
mean, it's true that the intelligentsia who wanted to leave the Soviet Union, but even when they came here, they wrote many, many essays discussing the fact that it is not so easy, and they used the comparison with Egypt of getting the slave mentality out of oneself. In other words, they knew intellectually there was distinct freedom, but they were at the same time acknowledging, even intelligent people,
Mhm.
not ordinary slaves, that one still had in one's inner self remains of this growing up with a slave mentality, and one had to work very hard, even in freedom,
Mhm.
to extract it from oneself. It's not possible.
Exactly. It's a difficult psychological process. And as we know, it ended up not being complete in this generation. As we know, this generation died out in the desert because they couldn't, couldn't complete it. They could not embrace not just the part of freedom from, but also the part of freedom to, of going and establishing a self-determined state where you have to deal with the realities of life and war and creativity on the ground with all its great difficulties. They couldn't embrace it when it came to them in the Chet of the Meraglim, and they had to die out for a new generation to rise. But there is a watershed moment, and here I use pun intended, so to speak, in watershed moment, where we see them not merely going out of Egypt, but recognizing that they're done with Egypt. And that is the opening of the sea, the opening of the Red Sea. Yes.
You can see a similar thing,
Mm-hmm.
quite shocked by what I say maybe, with kibbutznikim.
Mm-hmm.
People who grew up in the classic kibbutz, where everything was decided for them, where if you did anything that was not according to the accepted way, you were subject to criticism in the council.
Mm-hmm.
And when they left, they frequently had great difficulty in the decision-making process. for themselves and for their children.
I will,
I-
sorry, yes.
I worked with the kibbutz, and I remember I met people who said, I wanted to leave. I knew it was not for me. But as soon as I said it, they said, what are you talking about? You'll never survive outside.
Socialism and communism are related.
I mean, I will say-
When taught in a kibbutz, they didn't get their pension according to those years. They lost their budget. They had to start from scratch.
I will say something perhaps very controversial and uncomfortable right now. But, and forgive me, I'm not trying to condone it, but I'm saying it's, you hear the same things from people who left religion. Whenever you grow up in a certain system that there's a certain way of making decisions, where there's an external authority that defines for you what's right, what's wrong, what you're supposed to do, to a lesser or greater degree, right? And there's many different systems. Leaving that system requires you not simply to walk out the door, it requires you to build a whole new set of decision-making habits. And that is very, very challenging. Whether the leaving is something we view as positive or negative, the process is extremely painful and extremely difficult. And to a great extent, if you want to expand it, blow it up even wider, what we're watching in the modern world from the scientific revolution onwards, that is secularization of the world, is a crisis of values that stems exactly from that. From there was a certain way of doing things, and now we no longer believe in the sources of authority that underpinned that way. And we believe that people should be their own conscience. And it's very hard to be your own conscience. Erich Fromm, very popular in Israel for his book about love, about the art of loving, also wrote a great book called Escape from Freedom, where he talks about the crisis of modernity for the individual and how scary it is to suddenly be told that you're supposed to determine for yourself what's right and wrong. And how time and time again, modern individuals escape this burden by joining fascistic, communistic, whatever movements that suddenly give you the relief of somebody tells me what's right and wrong. A moment, okay, we're running out of time and I need to round it up, but I'll be happy to hear the comment in a bit. This is where the Jews are at this moment. They're out, but they're still the slaves of Pharaoh. They're still out by grace of the king. Later you can see there's this very famous letter that George Washington wrote to the Jewish community of Rhode Island in 1790, where he talks about how in the United States, the new United States, religious freedom is no longer something that one class tolerates, allows the other as a gift, but rather something that everybody has as an inherent right. You can look at it later for yourself. But in a sense, at this point in history, freedom for the Jews is still something that Paro extended to them. And then they reach the ocean and Paro is behind them. And now comes the moment of catharsis. Now comes the moment where they have to make a choice. Stay put or move forward. I'm sorry?
They have to act.
Exactly. They have to choose to act. And at first, they don't. At first, what do? They call to Moshe. Why did you bring us here? Aren't there enough graves in Egypt? Why did you bring us here? And Moshe says, don't worry, Hashem will do it for you. Hashem will save you. And this is the moment where Hashem intervenes, says, no, Moshe, you're getting the memo wrong. We're done with that. We're no longer in that stage of the story. And he says, I'm in the same box, in box 8 at the bottom, and verse 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward. And you lift up your rod and hold out your arm over the sea and split it so that the Israelites may march into the sea on dry ground. But the first thing that happens is not you open the sea and then they go. The king gives permission and then they go. I say so and then they go. No, the first thing is they themselves have to go. And what does the going means? The going means throwing yourself into death, embracing the possibility of death, because you're throwing yourself into an ocean that will devour you. And this is extremely critical because we talked today about two aspects of subjugation, right? We talked about fear later in the talk, but we also talked about the innocent belief that the system is your way of survival, that your survival depends on the system, on the king giving you grain, on the king giving you an army to protect your grain from bandits coming to take it, et cetera, et cetera. Both of these types of subjugation are very different. You know, perhaps we could say that some people followed Paro because they believe that it's for their own benefit, and some people followed Paro because they're too afraid not to. And people's experience different motivations motivate them. There were people in Soviet Russia who truly believed that the Soviet Union is the best system there is. There are millions and millions of them. So in our personal biography, we may be motivated by different types of internal enslavement, be it seeing the system as the face all of our benefit or seeing the system as this horrible killer that would kill us if we stray even a little bit off the party line. But both of these different branches of subjugation boil down to the same thing. They boil down to prioritizing physical survival over everything else. You're afraid for your survival, so you do what you're told. You want to survive, to live in a society that allows you to survive, and therefore you buy into the system that protects your life for you. In order to be free, and this is perhaps the message that God is forcing the Jews to embrace here as they throw themselves into the sea. In order to be free, you have to care about something beyond survival itself. As long as survival is your ultimate goal, you're handing the world the power to enslave you, because somebody will gain power over your survival and then you will do whatever they say. In order to be a free person, but more than that, to be a free people who can stand as partners for God and as a light unto the nations and fulfill their missions in the world, you can't be people whose ultimate goal and ultimate value is life itself in the most physical and simple of senses. And therefore, only after they throw themselves into the sea, after they embrace the possibility of death, can they come out on the other side and sing. And I'm turning here to the last page and sing. And Miriam chanted for them, about the horse and the driver that are drowned. And commentators say that it's a symbol for the whole hierarchic Egyptian system. Everybody is riding on somebody else and put their own narrative onto the story. They can suddenly turn the events into a poem because now they see it for what it is. Now, as we know, it's not over, it's not done. There's going to be a lot of moments of doubt and self-doubt and difficulty in the desert, and this generation is going to die out, and the struggle for freedom continues in every generation, and we all are slaves in some ways and hope to be free next year, as we say in Halach Ma'anya. But that moment, that pivotal moment when they saw that there's something that's worth more than survival, is the moment upon which God can build a foundation of freedom for us as a people. And on that note, thank you very much. We have a very short amount of time, but if anybody wants to ask or comment, you wanted to say something before? Yeah, so, yes.
Wonderful idea about the goals that of your physical survival, but I'm just wondering how they were, how it manifested that they were changing one master and a slave mentality to not considering God as the better master.
Right. Right. That's a big challenge in the reading of Exodus as the book. And we don't have time to go into it at great length, but I'll just a few ideas here. To really, I think, answer this question, we have to go to Shavuot. We have to go to Ma'amad Har Sinai, because Ma'amad Har Sinai is the moment where we become, where we enslave ourselves, if you will, to God, right? And it is bookended with 2 moments of consent. And the laws that we receive within it and add on to later quite extensively through several more books, but the laws we receive are laws that stand out, not necessarily for their liberality, or, a lot of people like to say that, oh, these are laws that were so just compared to other laws of the time. It's not such an even field. It's not such a clear scale, but they stand out in 2 ways. And here I'm following in the commentary of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, specifically in a book called Ceremony and something else with a C, festival, covenant and ceremony, or ceremony and festival, about the Chagim. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name correctly, but he talks about how the laws, and also in Michael Walzer in his book, In God's Shadow, where they talk about how the laws are unique in that they anchor themselves in reasonable explanations. In other words, it's not enough to say, because I told you so. It's the people have to, not saying that everything is explicable, but the people, it's assumed that the people should understand why they follow the law. And it anchors it in their experience, the constant repetition, because you were slaves in the land of Egypt, don't mistreat the widow, don't mistreat the stranger, free the slave in the 7th year, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, their own experience becomes the basis of the laws they accept, and not the king granting them certain laws and they are forced to accept. So it's very subtle, but I think that this would have to be the first step in answering your question, which, as I said, is a very big question, cannot be answered on one foot.
Well, a lot of it is in Bamidbar and Shoftim, in terms, those are the 2 big transition books.
Correct, and Shmuel also, I would say, but I would just say that I highly recommend Michael Walzer's book, In God's Shadow, Politics in the Hebrew Bible, that talks exactly about what it means to be a polity of God. Yes,
I would
Steffi.
say, though, we have to go a step beyond military, that even in the Soviet Union and other places, there were just interested in their survival, there were ideologues, and they believed in a system, and I think we have to ultimately say that the difference is, and even Dostoevsky understood this, the difference is that we believe in a divine ruler who says, even within we have our freedom, but he tells us ultimately what is right and wrong. And so we have our freedom, but on the other hand, unlike the ideologue who believes in communism and thinks everything for that goal is acceptable, including murdering, et cetera, et cetera. The difference ultimately is our freedom is circumscribed by the ultimate laws that we have to obey.
To build a little bit on what you're saying here, I would say, again, following Rabbi Sachs's interpretation very heavily, that the story of the Exodus, time and time again, signals to us that there are universal values. That unlike what the Egyptians perhaps believe, or people who buy into Putin's speech believe, that I quoted in the beginning, namely that good is defined by the good of the state, what's good for us. There are actually absolute good and absolute bad. And Rabbi Sachs uses the story of Moshe to illuminate it, when he shows how Moshe, time and time again, acts in ways that are unexpected for an Egyptian prince. He saves the Hebrew slaves from the Egyptian master. But then he intervenes between 2 Hebrews also. Then he helps Midianite girls. He's not treating people based on their identity. He's treating it based on what's right and wrong in his eyes. And in that, he's sowing the seed, or for us as the readers, of this bigger understanding that there is that cycle that Chazoni describes, the circle, the closed circles of crops, farmer, tax collector, king, etc. It's an illusion. And right and wrong should come from outside it. I would recommend one more article by Rabbi Sachs, The Weighing of the Heart, where he talks about, I think I even quoted somewhere in the source sheet, I'm not sure. And where he talks about how, to some extent, the story of the plagues is actually polemic against certain ideas, Egyptian ideas and Egyptian myths in that regard. I think we have to wrap up. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
And Pesach Sameach.